My dad called to ask how I liked the new truck. I'd been walking 2 miles to work for 6 months because we couldn't afford car insurance. I thought he'd dialed the wrong person. I even laughed a little, the automatic kind, the laugh you produce when something lands wrong and you're buying time to figure out why. Said, "What truck, Dad?" And the silence that came back through the phone was the kind that changes things, not the comfortable silence of a bad connection or a distracted parent. The other kind, the kind that has weight. He asked me to repeat myself, so I did. What truck? He said he'd been wiring $6,000 into my account every month since the wedding. 3 years of it. Said he'd set it up quietly because he didn't want it to feel like charity. He wanted me comfortable while I finished my master's degree. He figured we were probably saving most of it. Figured we were doing well and just being modest about it, the way young couples sometimes are when they don't want to seem like they're flaunting good fortune to family members who might not be doing as well. He said he was proud of that about us. I was standing in the Dollar General parking lot where I did most of our grocery shopping because the markup at the regular store made my chest tight in a specific way I'd gotten used to managing. I'd learned which days they restocked the clearance shelf. I had a system for the system. I knew the Tuesday truck delivery meant Wednesday morning was the best time to come. I knew the canned goods cycled before the dry goods. I knew which cashier would let me use an expired coupon if the line was short and the store wasn't busy. I told my dad I had never seen a single deposit. He didn't raise his voice, didn't say anything dramatic. He'd never been a dramatic man. He was an electrician from Akron, Ohio, who had worked 40 hours a week for 31 years and saved money the way some people collect things, quietly, consistently, with a private satisfaction he rarely talked about. He'd grown up without much and had built a life that had enough, and he was proud of the enough in a way that never tipped into show. When he had something to say, he said it once. When he needed time, he took it. He said, "Give me an hour," and hung up. I sat in my car, which was not my car. It belonged to my co-worker Marcus, who carpooled on Tuesdays and let me borrow his Civic on the days he didn't need it, which was 3 days a week if I was lucky. I had told my wife that I preferred walking because I wanted the exercise. I had told myself the same thing often enough that sometimes I believed it in the morning and stopped believing it by the time I reached the office. I tried to do the math. $6,000 a month for 3 years. I worked it out in pieces because the full number kept slipping. 6,000 times 12 was 72,000. 72,000 times 3 was $216,000. I said the number out loud in the Dollar General parking lot, to no one, to the windshield, to the empty passenger seat. $216,000. It didn't sound real. It sounded like a number from a different category of person, the kind of person who has a financial planner and a secondary account and a strategy, not someone who had spent 45 minutes on the phone with a student loan servicer the previous Thursday trying to understand a deferment that would add interest but reduce the monthly minimum to something survivable. I sat there for a long time. I thought about the winter of the first year. The bedroom heater had stopped working in November. Not dramatically. No smell, no spark, no visible failure. It simply stopped producing warmth one morning, and the room dropped to 54 degrees by 7 a.m. I'd gotten 2 quotes to fix it. The cheaper one was $800. I'd looked at our account balance, which was $612, and told my wife. She suggested we sleep in the living room until we could save up. It was closer to the kitchen, and the stove made it warmer, and it was only going to be a few weeks. We slept in the living room for 2 months. She'd had a portable space heater in her home office the whole time that she kept running during the day while she worked. I'd noticed it was warm in there when I came in to use the printer. I hadn't thought about it past that. I thought about my 31st birthday. She'd planned dinner at a restaurant I'd mentioned wanting to try. I'd been looking forward to it for a week. The morning of, I'd checked our account, and the balance was $92, 4 days before payday. I'd canceled the dinner and told her I wasn't feeling well. She'd seemed disappointed but accommodating. We'd had pasta at home. I felt grateful and guilty in equal measure and hadn't said a word about the account because the number had frightened me and I didn't want to frighten her. I thought about the tutoring jobs I'd picked up the previous spring. 3 high school students, twice a week each, $40 an hour. It wasn't much, but it was clean money. Mine, earned outside our shared account, and it gave me a feeling of traction I didn't have anywhere else in my financial life. I'd told my wife about it and she'd said she was proud of me, which had felt good. I'd told my dad too. He'd been watching me struggle, believing I was living on $6,000 a month, $216,000. I drove home and waited. My name is Daniel Pryor. I'm 33 years old, and until the afternoon I sat in a Dollar General parking lot doing math that didn't add up. I would have told you I was someone who paid attention. That was something I believed about myself. Not arrogant attention, not paranoid attention, just the ordinary vigilance of someone who grew up without excess and learned early that things didn't sort themselves out on their own. My father raised me alone after my mother left when I was 11. She stopped being present in increments until one day the increments added up to gone. My dad didn't talk about it much. He cooked dinner, showed up to my baseball games, paid the bills, kept the lights on, without complaint or performance. He never remarried. He had his friends from the Union Hall and his vegetable garden and a standing Sunday call with his sister in Cleveland. He'd worked for 30 years to save money because he hadn't had a father who did, and somewhere in that chain he decided the pattern was going to end with him. He didn't have a financial advisor. He had a spreadsheet he'd built in 2003 and updated every month. Income, fixed expenses, and what he called the float The money that didn't have a job yet. Patient money. It waited until it was needed. When I got married, he'd told me he wanted to help. Not a gift, he said. Not charity. Just some breathing room while I finished school. He knew my wife made good money at her firm. He knew my graduate stipend was barely enough to cover my share of expenses. He didn't want the financial gap between us to become a pressure point. He'd seen what pressure points did to young marriages. He'd set up the transfers through his bank, a direct wire to the joint checking account attached to my name and my wife's name, every first of the month for 3 years. He'd never asked about it because he'd never wanted me to feel monitored. He'd checked in about life, about my thesis, about whether I was sleeping enough, and whenever I said things were fine, he'd believed me because he had no reason not to. He had sent $216,000 into a black hole wearing my name, and I had walked 2 miles to work and redeemed coupons and slept next to a space heater in my living room and felt, in some private corner of myself, proud of my own resourcefulness. I should tell you about my wife. Her name was Cassandra. Cassie, to most people. 34 now, 31 when we met. She worked in corporate marketing at a mid-sized logistics company and had the kind of competence that read as effortless from a distance, which was exactly how she wanted it to read. She grew up in Cincinnati, youngest of 3 girls, and had the kind of precision most people don't bother with. The way she organized her inbox, tracked reservations, remembered names and details from conversations 6 months prior. It made people feel seen and known. I mistook that precision for honesty for a long time. They're not the same thing. We met at a work function I wasn't supposed to be at. I was finishing my first year of graduate school in organizational behavior and had volunteered to help a professor set up a panel event downtown. She was there as a panelist. She came in early, asked if there was somewhere she could charge her laptop, and when I found her an extension cord, she said thank you in a way that acknowledged me as a person rather than a function. We talked for 10 minutes. She asked what I was studying. I told her. She asked a follow-up question smart enough to make me want to keep talking. By the time the event started, she'd given me her number. We dated for 8 months before I met her family. I found out later this was deliberate. She controlled timing the way she controlled most things, slowly, with the appearance of it happening naturally. Her mother, Renata, lived 40 minutes away. Sharp, opinionated, clearly the center of the family's gravity. She'd looked at me across the dinner table the first time we met and asked what my father did for a living, and when I said electrician, she'd nodded in a way that told me she was filing the information into a category she'd already prepared. I should have paid more attention to that nod. We got married in June. Small wedding, 40 people, a rented space in the botanical garden. My dad stood next to me at the altar and kept clearing his throat, which was the closest he got to crying. Cassie walked down the aisle looking so certain about what she was doing that I felt certain too. The first year was fine. We were figuring out the shape of a shared life, which involves more negotiation than anyone tells you. She handled our finances, her suggestion presented as reasonable. She was better with numbers, she said, and it made more sense to have one person managing rather than 2, doing it inefficiently in parallel. She set up a system. Direct deposit for both of us into the joint account. Bills on autopay. A monthly transfer to a savings account she managed. She showed me the setup once on her laptop. I didn't ask to see the accounts after that, not because I was told not to, because she handled it, and handling it meant it was handled. I was finishing a graduate degree, teaching 2 undergraduate sections, writing a thesis on organizational trust and communication structures, which is one of those subjects that seems abstract until you are living through a case study of it in your own kitchen. The financial stress started in the second year, not dramatically, gradually. The margin got tighter. I noticed it first in the way she responded to discretionary spending. Any suggestion of a restaurant, a weekend trip, anything outside the fixed routine. She'd say, I don't think this is the best month for that, or we're a little close right now. I trusted her reads because she had visibility into the numbers. I assumed she was being prudent. I actually admired it. I didn't understand that there are 2 different reasons to be careful with money. One is because you don't have enough. The other is because the money that exists is going somewhere you can't see. By the second winter, I was tutoring on the side. By spring, I was walking when I could. By summer, I was doing the kind of low-grade financial calculation that becomes invisible when it becomes habitual. Checking the account before suggesting dinner, converting every optional expense into units of whether we can manage, telling myself this was temporary, telling myself it was the natural strain of 2 people building something. What I didn't know was that a third income had been flowing into that account every single month for 3 years. I was still sitting in Marcus's car when my dad called back. He'd used the hour. He'd called his bank and requested a detailed record of every transfer he'd initiated since the wedding. 62 wires. Everyone confirmed as received by the joint account. He'd also called his neighbor, Jim Castillo, who had retired from banking after 30 years and now grew tomatoes and consulted occasionally, and had the kind of financial forensics knowledge that gets built over decades of watching people move money in ways they weren't supposed to. Jim had asked him 2 questions. First, who else had access to the joint account? My wife. Her name was on it. Second, did I have independent login access to check balances and transactions myself? My dad paused when he got to this part. He said he'd realized in the pause that he didn't know the answer, that he'd assumed I did because it was my account, but he'd never confirmed it. I thought about that. I had never, not once in 3 years of marriage, checked the joint account independently. I'd asked about it occasionally. Cassie had shown me a balance or a summary when when I asked, which wasn't often because asking felt like distrust, and I hadn't wanted to distrust her. I had access to the account technically. My name was on it, but I had never used that access. I had given it to her the way you give someone the keys to a room and then stop going into the room because they seem to have it covered. My dad said, "I'm coming over." I said, "Okay." He said, "I'm bringing Jim." I got home 20 minutes before they arrived. My wife was at the kitchen counter with her laptop. She looked up and said, "You're home early," in the mildly questioning way of someone who notices deviations from the schedule. I said my dad was coming over. She said, "Is everything okay?" I said I wasn't sure. She closed her laptop. She had the ability to shift her attention like a physical action, complete and deliberate. She looked at me, said, "What happened?" I told her my dad had called to ask about the truck. I told her what he'd said. The transfers, 3 years, $6,000 a month. I watched her face while I said it. I had never been someone who watched people's faces when they spoke, but I was watching now. She was good. I want to say that because I think it matters. The confusion that moved across her face was constructed well enough that if I'd had any doubt about what my father had told me, that expression would have dissolved it. Just the right amount of confusion, not theatrical. The measured, natural-looking blankness of someone hearing something that doesn't compute. She said she didn't know what I was talking about. I told her my dad had the wire transfer records. She said there must be some mistake. I asked her to pull up the joint account. There was a pause. Small, maybe a second and a half. She reached for her laptop, navigated to the bank portal, turned the screen toward me. The balance showed $3,470. 3 years of deposits. $216,000 in, $3,470 left. She said, "See? I don't know what your dad is talking about. The account looks normal." I asked her to show me the transaction history. She clicked through. The last 30 days, groceries, auto pay bills, a gas station, a transfer out labeled savings on the 14th of each month. I asked her to scroll back further. She said the portal only showed 30 days. I asked her to pull the full statement. She said she'd have to call the bank. I said, "Okay, let's call." And that was when my dad's car pulled into the driveway. Jim Castillo was 67, gray, and had the calm of someone who had spent 3 decades watching financial irregularities play out across desks and conference tables and occasionally kitchen tables exactly like ours. He wore a flannel shirt, carried a legal pad, and shook my hand and then my wife's hand with equal neutrality. My dad set a folder on the table. He'd printed the transfer records at the library on the way over. 62 pages, one per transaction, dated, time-stamped, account number of origin, account number of destination. He pushed the folder across the table. Jim said, "The account number your husband provided to his father, the joint account, shows as the destination on all 62 transfers. Is that account number correct?" Cassie said yes. Jim said, "So those deposits arrived in the joint account." She said she supposed they must have. Jim said, "So where did they go?" She said she didn't know. Jim set his legal pad down. He said, "I've looked at enough account movement to recognize a pattern. 62 deposits, each for $6,000 over 36 months. That's $216,000 in. This account has a current balance of $3,470. That's a gap of over $212,000. Some went to legitimate household expenses. I'm not suggesting otherwise, but the gap requires an explanation." He said it with the tone of a man presenting a math problem, not an accusation. Cassie said the expenses over 3 years were significant. Jim said, "Can you walk us through the large transfers or withdrawals?" She said she'd need to pull the statements. Jim said, "Of course. Would you like to do that now?" Another pause. 3 seconds. She said she thought she should call her attorney first. She didn't want to misremember something and create confusion. My dad looked at me. I looked at Cassie. I said, "There's a transfer labeled savings that shows up every month. Where is that account?" She said she'd set it up for emergencies. I said, "What's the account number?" She said she'd have to look it up. Jim picked up his pen. She went into the home office. She was in there for 4 minutes. 4 minutes is long enough to send text messages, long enough to delete things, long enough to decide on a story. She came back with a piece of paper with an account number written on it. Jim looked at it. He said, "This is a different institution than your joint account." She said, "Yes." He said, "And this account is in your name only?" She said it was a household savings account. He said, "But is it in your name only?" She said, "Yes." He wrote something on the legal pad. My dad hadn't spoken since he'd put the folder on the table. He was looking at his hands. He had working hands, wide palms, short nails, the permanent rough texture of someone who'd used them for physical labor for decades. He was looking at them the way he did when he was thinking hard and didn't want anyone to know how hard. I said, "How much is in that account, Cassie?" She said she'd have to check. Jim said, "Would you be willing to log in now?" 4 seconds. She picked up her phone, navigated to an app, held it in a way that angled the screen away from Jim's line of sight. She looked at it, set it face down. She said it was about $68,000. I said, $68,000 from my father's transfers. She said things had been complicated. She'd been managing in a way she thought was responsible. She'd intended to tell me. She was protecting us. My dad looked up from his hands. He said, "From what?" "I want to tell you about the cruise." She'd posted it in October. 7 days, Eastern Caribbean, turquoise water, a pool deck, a dinner table with candles and a sunset behind it. She'd told me it was a company retreat, fully subsidized. I'd said it looked amazing. I'd liked one of the photos. I'd been working a double tutoring week that October. Jim asked about the cruise in a voice I'd come to recognize as his professional register. No emotional coloring, everything framed as inquiry. She said it was a work trip. Jim said, "Can you provide documentation of the employer subsidy?" She said she'd need to find the email. Jim said he could wait. Another pause. She said she'd have to look for it later. Jim said, for context, was anyone else on the trip with you? She said her colleagues. Jim said, was your sister on the trip? 3 seconds. She said, Danielle came along as a +1. Jim wrote something down. I had not known Danielle was on the cruise. Danielle, whose kitchen had gotten quartz countertops the previous spring. Danielle, who had told me at Christmas that business had been good. I said, who paid for Danielle's portion? She said the company covered it. I said, then why did a $4,700 charge from a cruise line post to our account 2 months before the photos went up? She said that must have been something else. Jim said, we can request the full statement and clarify. She was still performing. Even now, at this table, with 62 transfer records and a man with 3 decades of banking experience and a legal pad full of notes, she was still running the performance, adjusting, calibrating, finding the next plausible version. I had watched her do this for 3 years and called it competence. Her mother called it 8:17. Cassie's phone lit up on the table. She looked at it, let it ring, let it go to voicemail. 8 minutes later, it rang again. She declined it this time, the deliberate press rather than the passive wait. She was signaling to someone about the nature of the conversation she was currently in. Jim hadn't missed it. His expression didn't change. He said, let me be direct about where things stand from my perspective, speaking only as an observer with some background. You have a documented record of 62 transfers into a joint account. You have that account's current balance, which represents a fraction of the total deposited. You have a secondary account in one name holding a significant sum that appears to have moved from the joint account. And you have travel and retail charges that may not align with the stated purpose of an emergency fund. He said, none of this is my determination to make, but I want to be honest about what a bank's compliance department or an attorney or a civil court would say when they see this pattern. He said it without heat, with the calm of someone who has been in enough rooms where the truth gets laid on a table to know that the laying is the hard part and the silence after is just the room adjusting to the weight. Cassie said, I think I should call my attorney. My dad said, that's probably a good idea. I said nothing. She went into the home office and closed the door. My dad and I sat at the kitchen table. Jim poured himself a glass of water from the tap and sat back down. No one spoke for a while. The refrigerator made its usual sound. A car went by outside. My dad said, I'm sorry, Danny. I told him not to be. He said, I should have told you directly. Should have set it up in your name only. I told myself it was for the two of you, for the marriage. I was making it easier on myself not to look too closely. I knew what he meant. It's easier to give money to a household than to a person because a household doesn't carry the implication of surveillance. A household account is neutral territory. He'd extended trust in the most frictionless direction available, and the friction was exactly why the whole thing had worked. I told him I didn't blame him. He said, I'm still sorry. We sat there until Cassie came back out 20 minutes later. She said her attorney had advised her not to answer further questions this evening. She said she wanted me to know that she had always been trying to act in our best interest. I looked at her for a long moment. I said, you were the one who set up our account access. You showed me the system. You always showed me the balances when I asked, but you showed me what you opened, not a complete view. I never had independent login because you never set it up for me, and I never asked. She said, you never asked. The first honest thing she'd said all evening, delivered not as a confession but as a defense. I said, you're right. I never asked. Jim had stopped writing. My dad was looking at his hands again. She left that night to stay at her mother's. She packed with the practiced efficiency of someone who had considered the possibility. 2 bags. The second one told me how thoroughly she'd considered it. My dad stayed another hour. He and Jim sat at the table talking logistics. Who to call, what records to secure. Jim had a contact, a woman named Rachel Fine who specialized in civil financial disputes and had handled cases with similar patterns. He said he could make a call in the morning. I said yes. My dad left at 11. He hugged me at the door the way he hugged me when I was a kid after something hard had happened. Long, without padding, the kind that has no performance component, just duration. He said, call me tomorrow. I sat at the kitchen table with the 62 pages my father had printed at the library on the way over. I thought about the tutoring sessions, Marcus's car, the birthday dinner I'd canceled, the heater, the student loan deferment, the Dollar General system, the 2 miles each way, every day, and the small humiliation that had become ordinary enough to stop registering as humiliation. I hadn't been broke. I'd been robbed slowly by someone who understood that the most effective theft is the kind that leaves the target feeling responsible for the shortage. Then I called Rachel Fine's voicemail and left a message. Rachel Fine's office was on the 14th floor of a glass building downtown. She was 44, compact, precise in the way of someone for whom precision is both a professional asset and a personal preference. No decorative objects on her shelves, only books and binders. She greeted me with a handshake and said, Jim Castillo spoke highly of your father. Tell me what happened. Start wherever the story starts for you. I talked for 50 minutes. She asked focusing questions throughout, the kind that means she was assembling an architecture. When did the financial management shift to your wife entirely? When did you first notice a reduction in available funds? Did you have independent access to the joint accounts online portal? Had your wife ever explicitly discouraged you from checking the accounts? That last question, I said, not explicitly, but when I'd start talking about money, she'd usually redirect. Reassure me, say she had it covered. I thought that was her being efficient. Rachel wrote something down. She turned her computer screen toward me. A split screen. On the left, the full statement from the joint account going back back 36 months. On the right, the secondary account's transaction history. She said, your father's transfers arrived on the 1st of each month. Within 48 to 72 hours, a corresponding amount left the joint account for the secondary savings account. The amounts vary slightly, deliberate irregularity to avoid pattern detection, but the timing is consistent. The secondary account received approximately $184,000 over 36 months. I said, she told us it had $68,000. Rachel said, that's the current balance. The remainder was dispersed. I've identified approximately $41,000 in transfers to a third account. A third account. She said, that account appears to be in your mother-in-law's name. The room didn't move. Everything just reconfigured slightly. The way a picture looks different when you finally see the thing that was hiding in plain sight from the beginning. I said, Renata. She said, yes. I said, for how long? She said the transfers to Renata's account began approximately 20 months into the marriage. Irregular in amount and timing. Again, deliberate construction rather than routine. Total, approximately $41,000 over 16 months. She said, the credit card connected to the secondary account shows charges inconsistent with an emergency fund. High-end retail, travel, dining, and there's a cruise line charge for approximately $4,700. Did you and your wife take a cruise? I said, she told me it was a work retreat. Rachel made a note. She said, there's no record of employer reimbursement. The charge was paid in full from the secondary account. The booking was for 2 passengers. I said, her sister was with her. Rachel said yes. She told me what we could pursue. Civil recovery for the redirected funds, fraudulent transfer, financial abuse under applicable domestic statute. She said the documentation was strong. She said the mother-in-law's involvement strengthened the fraud argument because it demonstrated collaborative intent rather than individual mismanagement. Then she said something I hadn't expected. She said, I want to ask about your emotional state going into this. Not because I'm a therapist, because clients in your position sometimes make decisions in the first weeks that complicate the case. Reaching out directly, negotiating informally, agreeing to arrangements that undercut formal proceedings. I said I understood. She said, you may also find yourself wondering if you misread something. That's a normal response. It doesn't mean you're wrong. It means you were close to the situation and you're adjusting. I told her I didn't think I was going to misread this one. She said, good. Cassie called that evening. I let it ring. She texted 3 minutes later, I know how this looks. I need you to hear my side before you do anything permanent. Please. I typed, Rachel Fine is handling it from here. Her number is available through her firm's website. Then I put the phone face down and made dinner. Pasta from scratch because it was something my hands knew how to do, and I needed something my hands knew how to do. She texted twice more that night. The second one was several paragraphs, the right emotional beats in the right order. She was sorry. She'd made decisions under pressure she couldn't fully explain right now. She had always loved me. She had always wanted us to be okay. I noticed the word money did not appear in it anywhere. Renata called me 4 days after the table meeting. She led with warmth, said she was worried about me, said she just wanted me to know she cared about what happened to me, whatever I might think. I said, I appreciate that, Renata. She said Cassie had been managing under pressure I might not have fully understood from where I was sitting. I said, what pressure was that? She said my financial situation had been very unstable and Cassie was trying to create security. I said, with money my father sent for our household expenses. She said, money is complicated in a marriage. Things blend together. I said, Renata, I have your account number. Silence. Not the calibrated kind, the real kind. 2 seconds of a person who has been caught and knows it and is searching the list of available responses and finding that the list has suddenly shortened significantly. She said, I don't know what you're talking about. I said, $41,000 over 16 months. Transfers from a secondary account in Cassie's name to an account in yours. Rachel Fine has the documentation. She said those were loans between family. I said, were they documented as loans? She said, we had an understanding. I said, write it down and send it to Rachel's office. She said, Daniel, please don't do something that can't be undone. I said, I'll let you know if I think of anything. Then I hung up. Rachel filed the civil complaint 6 days after our first meeting. It named Cassie as primary defendant. It outlined the full pattern: deposits, redirections, secondary account, tertiary transfers to Renata, travel and retail expenditures. It cited civil statutes for fraudulent transfer and financial abuse within a domestic partnership. It included the cruise booking confirmation, 2 passengers, no employer reimbursement. Cassie's attorney responded within 48 hours. The letter argued the transfers represented legitimate household management decisions made with mutual understanding. It did not explain the $41,000 to Renata. It did not explain the cruise. Rachel said, they'll make a settlement offer within 2 weeks. She was right. It came in 11 days. The number was low. Rachel wrote a response explaining, politely and exhaustively, that we were neither desperate nor uninformed. The second offer came 4 days later. Better, still not close. She also said she'd referred the offshore transfer question to a contact at the IRS Financial Crimes Division. It was out of our hands, but in the right ones. Rachel said, discovery is going to be productive. Let's not settle before we see what it produces. I said, okay. The days that followed had a strange texture. I was still going to work, still teaching my sections, finishing the thesis, borrowing Marcus's car on Tuesdays. The external shape of my life had not changed, which felt disorienting, because the internal structure had been completely dismantled and was in the process of being rebuilt on a different foundation than I thought I was standing on. Marcus knew something was off. off. He didn't ask. He was good at reading the weather of a person's situation and understanding when questions help and when they don't. My thesis was titled Organizational Trust Structures and the Cost of Asymmetric Information Access. It had begun as an abstract academic exercise and had become, somewhere in the middle of writing it, something I understood from the inside in a way I'd never intended. The settlement was reached in April. Discovery had produced documentation Cassie's attorneys hadn't anticipated, including internal messages between Cassie and Renata, establishing, in fairly direct language, that the fund management strategy had been discussed and coordinated between them. The messages referenced specific transfers, specific amounts, and in one exchange the phrase, "he doesn't check the accounts." Renata's attorney filed separately, requesting her involvement be characterized as passive receipt rather than active participation. Rachel's response was comprehensive enough to make that position difficult to sustain. The settlement covered the redirected household funds minus legitimate expenses, the cruise, the retail charges, and a penalty figure for the demonstrated pattern of concealment. Renata's portion was addressed in a separate agreement. The IRS matter remained open on its own timeline. The divorce was finalized the same week. I think about the Dollar General system sometimes, not with bitterness, with something closer to scientific interest, the knowledge of which cashier would take an expired coupon, the Tuesday restocking schedule, the way I arranged my list to minimize backtracking. These were real adaptations to a real constraint, and they worked. I was good at managing on very little because I'd grown up watching someone who was good at managing on very little. The constraint was manufactured, but the adaptations were real. The skills were real. There's something in that I'm still working out. The way you can be deceived about the conditions of your life without being wrong about how you responded to those conditions. I wasn't naive. I was given a false map and navigated it as well as the map allowed. The problem was never my navigation. I defended my thesis in February. The committee was 5 people. Dr. Kwan said afterward in the hallway that it was the strongest defense she'd heard in her time on the committee. Then she said, "What you went through this year is visible in the revision work, not in a sad way, in the way that happens when someone has been thinking very hard about what trust costs." I thought about that for a long time. My dad flew in for the defense. He took a red-eye and arrived at 7 a.m. with coffee and a box of pastries from the bakery near his house, the ones with apricot filling that he'd driven 20 minutes out of his way to buy because I'd said at age 12 they were my favorite, and he'd never stopped getting them for occasions. He looked at my apartment, small, 1 bedroom, a window with afternoon light. He said, "It's good." I said, "Yeah." He said, "I like the light." We ate the pastries and talked about the defense and his garden. He didn't mention Cassie or the case or any of it, not because he was avoiding it, because he'd said everything he needed to say, and now we were at the part where you just continued to exist. After the defense, we went to a steakhouse near campus that had been there since 1974. He ordered a beer and the ribeye and raised his glass. He said, "To the degree." I raised mine. He said, "Also, for what it's worth." He set his glass down. "You figured it out. Took longer than it should have, but it wasn't your failure. It was a system designed to make sure you didn't. You shouldn't have had to fight through that to see what was true." I said, "I know." He said, "I'm not sure you do yet. Completely. I mean the part where you don't carry any of this as a reflection of your judgment." I said, "I'm working on that part." He said, "Good. I bought a truck in September. Used, 4 years old, 44,000 miles, a small dent on the rear bumper I didn't bother fixing because the mechanic said it was cosmetic. My dad asked how I liked it. I told him I liked it a lot. He said, good. He'd wanted to help with the down payment. I said no. He didn't push. He knew when I meant it. Cassie called once, 8 months after the settlement. It was a Wednesday evening. I saw her name and felt, mostly, the absence of something that used to be there. Not relief, not grief, just vacancy where a thing used to be. I answered. She said, "I know I don't have a right to call." I said, "What do you need?" She said she wanted to say she was sorry, not in a letter from an attorney, just directly. I said, "Okay." She said, "I don't expect that to change anything." I said, "It doesn't." She said, "I know." There was a pause. Not the calculated kind I'd learned to clock at the kitchen table, just the ordinary silence of 2 people at the end of something. She said, "I hope you're doing okay." I said, "I am." She said, "I'm glad." I believed her, actually. Not in a way that restored anything, but I believed she meant it. People capable of sustained deception are not incapable of genuine feeling. It's easier to require that the people who hurt you be fully bad all the way through. The truth is messier. I said, "Take care of yourself." She said, "You too." That was the last time we spoke. I called my dad that night. It was almost 10, past the window when he usually answered, but he picked up on the second ring. He was probably awake planning the spring garden layout, which he did on graph paper, moving things around with a pencil. I told him Cassie had called. He said, "How was it?" I said, "Quiet." He said, "Good quiet or hard quiet?" I said, "Just quiet." He said, "Okay." We talked for an hour. About the postdoc, about what spring looked like in the new city, about whether heirloom tomatoes were worth the extra trouble, a question he'd been debating with himself for 3 seasons without landing on an answer. He thought they were. He also thought he kept overcomplicating it. Before we hung up, he said, "You know what I keep thinking about?" I said, "What?" He said, "I keep thinking about how long you walked to work without saying anything." I said, "I didn't want you to worry." He said, "I know. That's what I keep thinking about." I said, "I'm telling you now." He said, "Yeah." He said, "I know." The truck was in the lot outside my building. 4 years old, 44,000 miles, a dent I hadn't fixed. I'd driven it to the grocery store that morning without thinking about gas money or Marcus's schedule or whether the Tuesday restock had happened. I'd parked close to the entrance and gone in and bought what I needed and left. It was such a small thing. It was not a small thing at all. She kept the account balance she hadn't disclosed. Her attorneys had argued it into the settlement as a disputed figure, and Rachel had calculated that contesting it further would cost more in time and fees than it was worth. Around $40,000 not recovered. I kept the records, every transfer, every statement, every page my dad had printed at the library on the way over to our kitchen table. Not because I needed them, because some things deserve to be documented, and because he'd driven to the library and printed 62 pages and brought them over without being asked, and that was worth keeping somewhere.